My name is Jim Weisser. I'm a serial entrepreneur, or perhaps recovering entrepreneur. I'm not sure which. But since I'm running my own company right now, I can't be recovering anymore. Anyhow, I'm the CEO and co-founder of SignTime. I will let Eric and Iitani-san introduce themselves briefly in a moment. But the short of it is, this particular set of lawyers are also entrepreneurs. They've been running their own firm focused on technology and smaller venture companies, I guess some larger ones too. Yeah, for about 7 years. And so I'm really excited to have them here tonight.
Hello. So I started my career a long time ago in Silicon Valley, right at the time when the first bubble burst, the first .com bubble. So I started in September of 2000. Did nothing but VC work for 3 or 4 months, and then in January, February, there was no more VC work. So I switched to bankruptcy, worked on the Enron case for a couple of years.
But we call that a pivot, Eric.
A forced pivot. And when the markets came back, I sort of resumed VC work. And so I spent the first 7 years in Silicon Valley, San Francisco, and then I moved to Tokyo, where I joined White & Case, and I'm sure many of you know Bob Rondine. So he's the one who hired me. I worked under him for several years, and I loved working with him and working at White & Case, except that I really missed working with startups. At White & Case, Mangyo and then Takeshi joined, and we started working a lot together. We had similar interests, and after a couple of years together, we thought it would be interesting to try to create a firm that would allow us to work with entrepreneurs, to work with smaller companies, work with VC funds, and meet great people like Jim who are doing fascinating things. So that's why we're.
Thanks, Eric.
Hi, I'm Takeshi Iitani, and I started my career as an in-house staff of a listed company in Japan. It's a Kao Corporation, which is a manufacturer of shampoos and yeah, and then I spent 5.5 years there, and then I decided to be a lawyer. And then I went to law school in Japan, and I qualified in Japan in 2008. And then I joined the Tokyo office of Melvin and Myers. And then I moved to White & Case together with Mangyo, who was scheduled to join us today. After we started to study Southgate, we had a lot of chances to work for startups, and that's what we were enjoying. So look forward to sharing our experience and expertise with all today. Thank you.
Are actually running a startup or have angel invested in a startup tonight? Yeah, sure. Okay. How many of you are startup servicers? Lawyers or whatever? Okay. And how many of you are in other things that are just interested in this because it seems kind of interesting and cool and different, or has someone made you come tonight? Thanks. Yeah, the establishment of the company. Now, probably from an entrepreneurial perspective, the least interesting thing. Yeah, but also the pieces where if you get it wrong, it can give you headaches for the rest of the company's life. So I don't know which of you would be a better lead on that, but would be happy to hear about GK, KK, Delaware, Japan KK, and any other things that you might wish to speak to.
So if the choice is between GK and KK, there really is no choice. You have to go with the KK. It's similar to the debate between an LLC and a C Corp in the US. So an LLC makes sense from a tax perspective for a lot of companies, but almost everyone establishes in the US as a C Corp because that's what the market expects, not because it's the better choice from a tax perspective, but because that's what VCs expect. Now, LLCs in the US can list. In Japan, the question is even easier because GKs cannot be listed, and so sometimes you do see LLCs or startups that adopt the LLC form in the US. In Japan, from what I understand, you never see the GK form because no one would invest in it. I don't know if you've seen examples of startups that are GKs
Yeah, I think some startup, the entrepreneurs start their business by incorporating GK purely because they do not expect investors to invest funds into their companies. But if they have a plan to collect funds from investors, I think that the KK would be the only choice.
Right, okay, so if you're building a Japan entity and you're looking at enterprise value more so than tax minimization personally, the KK is the only way to go. Okay, great. What about Delaware? Yeah, I've seen some VC funds that say, look, the US compliance is high enough, we only invest in US entities.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there are more and more Japanese companies or Japanese entrepreneurs who are starting their companies in Delaware, and you also see. Right now, we're working on two inversions. These are both very young KKs. The founders went to UC Berkeley. There's a Skydeck incubator there. They met some potential entrepreneurs, and they realized they could probably raise more money in the U.S. than in Japan. And so they've decided to convert to Delaware companies. And so it's easy to do at a very early stage if you don't have many shareholders. Once you've done Series A or B, it becomes much more complicated. But if you want to raise money in the U.S., then you really need to be there. And but if you do that, you have to recognize that there are a number of Japanese funds that cannot invest in the U.S. that will not, or rather, they will not invest outside of Japan. So by converting to a Delaware C Corp, you are somewhat limiting the universe of potential funders in Japan. But you have a lot more options in the U.S. Having said that, the U.S. is a very, very competitive market. In Japan, my understanding, and you would know better than I, is that you can find small amounts of money pretty easily from governmental institutions. In the U.S., that kind of money is just not available. So we have seen companies that have gone to the U.S., haven't been able to raise any money, and then have had to come back or don't have enough money to come back. And then after they've grown quite big, so not, after they've already done 3 or 4 rounds of financing, they converted to a Japanese company to do an IPO here. Now, that's pretty unusual, but you do see that sometimes.
Right.
One of the questions with regard to, let's say, U.S. entities is investments by foreign entities and concerns by the OFAC or FIRMA or the other, terrorist funding and other types of restrictions the U.S. is implementing. Are you seeing that impact a lot of your clients and where they want to invest or where they want to form?
No. You see those reps coming from U.S. investors more than Japanese investors, so they demand that in the documentation. And the kinds of clients we have, they're not, usually in a business where that's a heavy risk, so they're happy to accept those reps. And so having to deal with money laundering, sanctions, and so forth. So it's true that international investors, especially U.S. investors, in their documents when they invest, they insist on much more comprehensive representations and warranties about those points. You don't see that as much in the U.S. In Japan. Though foreign investors that are investing in Japanese startups are now demanding those those representations. So we do sometimes see that when we're representing more late-stage Japanese companies that are receiving funding from overseas funds.
For Hong Kong, what is looking at raising money in Asia for?
So we have one client that's in the holding company is in Singapore, right? Yeah. So we do have one company which at one point was a high-flying startup that established its head office in Singapore purely to raise money in Southeast Asia, and that it worked. I mean, the problem is COVID and the business. It's not the structure, but the structure worked well. And also, I think it probably is easier for a lot of foreign funds to invest in, say, Singapore than Japan, because in Singapore the documentation is in English, and Japan it's all in Japanese.
when you're looking at founders and how they do equity allocations, yeah, some of the things that show up frequently are, okay, this person's bringing more money, but this person has a greater opportunity cost. Yeah, how do you do share allocation that way, and what's the Japanese governmental approach? So that's kind of one case, and then in the case of like founder vesting, and I think Scott, you alluded to this earlier, that startups can be very trying on relationships. And so at the point one of the founders is ready to leave, how do you handle things like founder share vesting and the other kind of exit that's nowhere near as positive as the difficult exit?
And in terms of founder vesting, so maybe you can talk a little about the typical buy-sell agreements that founders enter into, because that's quite different from the practice in, say, the US.
So in Japan, it is very typical for founders to enter into a founders agreement or founding shareholders agreement. And if any of multiple founders leave the company for any reason, basically they have to sell their shares back to the remaining founders. And then as time goes by, the leading founders may be able to add some value to the company or contribute to the success of the company for the time being. So in that case, the number of shares that they have to sell back to other founders will continue to increase over 12 or 24 months. So this is a very typical
Okay.
We're required to purchase the shares back. It has to be
there has to be some surplus for
Yeah.
the company to purchase
Right.
back.
If the company is under, it's not making money, then obviously the company can't buy back the shares.
So
Yeah.
if you're ACCJ, you can't buy.
Yeah.
Right. So usually there's the company has the first right, and then if the company can't exercise it, it can go to founders.
The company can't buy it at all though, if it's like ACCJ nothing.
Right. Yeah. So in the US you also have a similar concept, and so there too, it's a first right in favor of the company, and then afterwards it also.
If the repurchase price is quite low, it will be possible for the company to purchase back the shares at a very low price. So
Sorry, Weezy. The aggregate value of the shares is low.
The initial allocation of shares between founders, and this can be a big problem in Japan if you have one founder, say, who's bringing in cash,
Right.
and another founder who's bringing in, say, IP. Because in the US, for example, under that scenario, if you have one person who's bringing in, say, $50,000, another person who's bringing in IP, the founders can say, I don't know what your IP is worth, but I value this IP. Let's just split the company 50-50. In Japan, you can't do that. In Japan, I'm not going to go into details, but there's a rule that says that if you provide non-cash consideration, so for example,
Shares.
Shares, yeah, but IP is the best example. You have to have the court appoint an appraiser to value the IP, and then only at that point can you allocate shares. And this may work well for big companies, but it doesn't work well for startups when the cost of the appraiser could be more than what the founders are willing to put into the company. And it also takes a lot of time. And also, you just don't know what the appraised value will end up being.
So to restate what you're saying, Eric, if I'm really clever and I figured out some things, and I have a potential patent, I don't actually have a patent, I bring that, and my buddy's got $20,000 in the bank. I say, great, man, close enough. 20,000 bucks isn't a lot of money. Let's call it even.
Yeah.
We would need to hire a court-appointed inspector. What's that cost? 500,000 yen?
well, actually, practically speaking, nobody uses that.
Oh, okay.
Appointed inspector route. So I think I do not have any experience
Okay.
in my professional life. So
Okay.
and even listed company, Japanese listed company would not use that system.
Okay, so look, we know that startups manage to get by anyway. In that kind of a situation, is there a workaround available that doesn't specifically value the IP in certain ways, but might recognize one founder's contribution will be greater during certain periods of the company than others?
So, there are exceptions to the rule. One exception is that if you can find, say, a law firm or an accounting firm
Yep.
that will give you a reasonable valuation of what the IP is worth, you can base it on that. But
Oh, okay.
I haven't met a law firm that would do that. We certainly would never do that. I don't know of an accounting firm that would do that without charging a lot of money.
Structurally and completely legally would be to do, if we want to split our valuable contributions, would be to do a 2 yen capitalization company where I put in 1 yen, you put in 1 yen, and then you lend the company the remainder of your amount, and I contribute my IP, and then at least it's only a debt rather than an equity exchange at that point.
So one practical theoretical solution is to, for the founder having an IP, to sell the IP to the company. And in exchange for that, the founder can have a claim, an intermediate claim against the company. And one exemption to such the court-appointed inspector regulation is that if you have a monetary claim against the company, and then if the total value of the shares
Yes.
is equal to or less than the value of the claim, monetary claim, you don't have to ask a court to appoint an inspector. So you can do the in-kind contribution without court involvement. But this arrangement could be deemed to be abused or the use of loophole of the regulation.
Right.
So some practitioners argue that this should be a solution.
So-
But I'm a bit cautious about
I think the
it.
problem with that is that you have to worry about how much each of your shares are worth. So if your company is worth a very small amount and you wanna sell it for a large amount or whatever, then obviously, you have to worry about that. But I think it'd probably be best to create a company where if the share is worth 1 yen, whatever, and then just, have a good relationship with your partner. I think that's the best thing there.
Sorry, what I'm taking out of it is when you're talking about small amounts, I think, Chris, this is what you're talking about too. When you do small amounts and small values, it's a lot easier than if someone says, well, this IP is worth $1 million, or sorry, whatever, Ethiopian, than if you're saying, well, man, it's worth 100,000 yen.
Yeah, and to your point, this rule only affects contributions in kind in excess of 5 million yen. So if you value it at less than that, then you don't have to go through these procedures.
Okay.
But obviously,
Is the value, you say the value should not be tied to the shares in Japan. The shares are kind of like just a nominal 1 yen value, and you want to find other agreements like claims or debts, which is where you are going to assess the value that everyone brings and.
well, I don't think if on day one you attach a very, very low valuation to the company, then it's easy among founders to, who don't have much money to have equal shares. But once you start bringing outside money in, you can't do that anymore.
If it's a small company value, regardless of how many shares you have, it's relatively easy to, say, oh, well, this is worth this. I mean, as Eric pointed out, the ceiling of 5 million yen as an in-kind, I guess, is that the right way to phrase it? And there's a ceiling of 5 million yen on in-kind contribution. So if you start out with an aggregate value that's whatever, 3 million yen, 5 million yen, something like that, it's easy to do. But once you've done pre-seed investment, you have a higher value than 5 million yen. And so that's where it gets very, very tricky. Once the company has at least something resembling a business, doesn't even have to be a real business, but it's like, okay, you have a couple customers, the likelihood of your valuation being more than 5 million yen is fairly high.
I think here's one thing that I think a lot of people forget, and actually it's kind of, the law has fortunately changed, so it's possible, but early on, it wasn't possible to create like a street company at the beginning of it, create a class share class, especially at the beginning. I mean, you might have tried to ask them or something like that.
I've actually-
Yeah, exactly.
I've done it, but yeah.
So, I guess as an American person, one of the interesting things about Japanese law is that it's not about the expression of what you can put into a contract. It's actually more governed by the body of law versus the actual, contract. So what that means is that the amount of kind of customization you can do in your contracts is very limited. And so when you create a company, there's a few options that you can choose, but for the most part, it's pretty much cut and dry. Exactly what's going on. So
good. Sorry.
right. And so I think one of the things is at least if I were to start a company today, what I would really do is start with a stock structure of $1 yen per share, and then you could put in like a whatever each yen, 10,000 yen, and you'd have 10,000 shares, and it'd be pretty cheap. I think the big thing that you have to think about is that the governing law and then also the taxation are two different parts of the coin. So you can price your stock whatever you want, but then at the same time you have to worry about obviously the taxation issues with taxation afforded. So in other words, when you put a new price on your share, obviously if you get to a point where you're over maybe $50,000 US or whatever, then you start getting to a point where you have to really certify that your shares are worth what they are. One of the things that is, I guess, it's a good way to structure things is that you can create different classes of shares. And so in these different class structures, this is a very fuzzy area, is that maybe it's fuzzy, that's why it's so great, is that as long as you don't share the cells and share the shares, and the shares are differentiated by different class structures. So for instance, if you have like A structure and then A, B, or whatever, you can create different types of shares. You can assign different values to those shares, and then when you decide to go in later and do like maybe for IPO, or you have an M&A event, you can then consolidate and collapse those shares, those different share structures, into a common stock. And this is probably something that they already have in their.
Yes.
No, actually, this is a really.
Of course, you don't really assign a value to the common stock. It's more the value derives from how much money was put into the company, and you divide the money put into the company by the number of shares, and that's the price per stock.
Right. So to your point, Eric,
Yeah.
it's book value divided by share count.
Yeah. And then if you create Series A, for example, if you create a series of preferred stock, the preferred stock, they're called preferred stock because they have rights and preferences and privilege that are superior to those of the common stock. And the main one is the liquidation preference. If there's a liquidation, the preferred stock, they get their money back first. Or there's an M&A event, for example. So the Series A, they get their money before the common. So therefore, to one price differential between the first, between common and the first series of preferred, whether it's called Series C or whether it's called Series A. When I started back.
So in a value accretive event, you're saying that the preferred shareholders get 4x the return of the common?
No, the
No.
preferred
Okay.
shareholders.
Okay. Sorry. No. Just wanted to clarify that.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's really in a non-value accretive, a liquidation, a look, it's worth something event, rather than, oh my God, how did we get by without you event.
You're trying to create a contrast. So the most important thing is for tax stuff is that the shares are different than the other shares.
Right.
So by putting a preference on it, you can say that this share class has a professional treatment, a gradient over the other ones. So
Right.
you can say to the accountants that it's different.
Yes.
The possibility of getting your money back is gonna be higher on the issue.
Right.
The price differential between common and preferred is important for two reasons. And the first one is what you've been mentioning, which is that this is from the company's perspective. It's important because the company can sell can sell fewer shares at a higher valuation.
Right.
So it suffers less dilution because if you're selling common at $1 versus preferred A at $4, you're going to raise a lot more money and suffer less dilution if you're selling preferred. And then the other advantage has to do with stock options. For tax qualified stock options in Japan and in the US, the stock options have to be issued at fair market value.
Yeah.
And so, stock options are always issued in the form of common stock or options that convert into common stock. So if you're selling, and this is what many Japanese companies do, if you don't have the price differential between common and preferred, then you're selling preferred, but at the same price as you would sell common. So you're suffering a lot of dilution, and when you grant stock options to your employees, they have to, the same exercise price, they have to pay as much as outside investors. Whereas in the US, if you have a big price differential,
In Japan, the tax treatment, at least, of a preferred share class and the valuation therein versus a common is not nearly as substantial as what you'd see in the US. Is that a generally true statement?
I don't think it has to do with tax. I think
A
it's
valuation statement?
I think it's more, it's easier, well, it's part of market practice in the US that there's a very high premium, at least for early stages of
Early stage preferred.
preferred.
Right.
Later stages, it merges towards one because.
Right, because the company exists.
Because it exists, and as it grows bigger, if it
Yep.
does a successful M&A, a successful IPO, then there's really no difference in valuation since they convert on a one-to-one basis.
Yep.
But I think in Japan, and Takeshi and I, we've discussed this with a few firms that do valuations. The problem is it's really hard to get firms that will offer, give you a valuation of the preferred stock, so that you can show the tax authorities that there's a difference in price. It's very expensive. In the US, you have what are called 409A valuations. They're almost pro forma. They cost almost nothing. And as long as you have that, you can tell the IRS, you can defend the price differential. But in Japan,
Right.
you don't have that industry. And we have spoken with at least one company that can do these valuations, but they take a long time, they're expensive, and that's the only company we found that can do it.
The most important thing, actually, it's really the most important thing that you could ever decide when you're starting a company, is to figure out what you're gonna do with that, yeah.
So.
Cause it's the main
sorry.
vehicle of how you can get money into your company.
Understood, I agree.
Yeah, just one question. So that means that when the stock price goes high, there is
Theoretical stock price.
theoretical stock price, then the tax related to that price will be unavoidable, and
No, that's not the issue, because if you're selling shares at a higher price, there's a higher basis. I think the problem is defending the valuation.
Right. I wanna say, you know what, I wanna do my employee stock option, my stock option price. What's the lowest you've seen the stock option price go out at that was still not considered within reason under the Japan regimen?
Well, so in Japan, so I think we will mention this in more detail later, but in Japan, there are certain special type of stock options, and that is tax qualified stock options.
Sorry, I meant the tax qualified ones.
Right. And then if you want to issue tax qualified stock options, the exercise price has to be equal to or more than the fair value of the shares at the time of the grant of the stock options. And so
Not underwater.
right. So that the setting of the exercise price is very important.
Yeah.
And so theoretically, even if, so for example, in your example, if your company issues Class A preferred shares to investors, and you would like to get higher valuation to get more money for fewer shares from the investor,
Right.
so you would like to argue that hey, this Class A preferred shares should have a higher valuation or higher value than the common shares at the time of the issuance of the preferred class shares. But in Japan, as Eric said, it's very difficult to find to get an accountant or a valuation firm to prove that willing to issue an opinion or valuation that the value of the preferred A shares is 4 times as much as the common shares at the time at the same
So
time.
often you don't see spreads, which is very vexing, but
Well, I have talked to some valuation firms, and
Yeah.
then they unofficially said that it should be 2 times to 4 times difference, but it's quite difficult to issue an opinion to that effect. So
So where do most opinions get issued?
well, they don't.
Hopefully don't, yeah.
But then you don't get qualified stock options.
Yeah, many people don't use it because it's such a hassle.
Right, but when you have a less than happy ending, like a not so positive outcome, is there any redeeming value in the money that you actually spent in Japan? Can you claim it against any kind of tax loss anywhere else? Right? Like 9 out of 10 of these of these investments
So
don't.
there's two things. One, if it's Angels ACA compliant,
Yeah.
it immediately reduces your tax burden in that year. Now, that's a maximum of 8 million yen in a given year, so.
If they liquidate, right?
No, when you make the investment, if it's an
Yeah.
Angels ACA qualified company and they file for all the pieces, which is a bit of a pain, but it's doable. The second thing is, if you have, so when private companies exit, you can offset private company losses against them.
Back to your question about taxes, and what are the risks. The risk is that if you have a company that issues, say, Class A, at a per share valuation that's, let's say, 4 times higher than the valuation of common, and at the same time, the company is granting stock options to its employees, and the strike price is equal to the fair market value of the common at the time, which is 1/4 the price of the Series A, the tax authorities can come in and say, the strike price is too low, because you were selling shares at 4 times this valuation. So that's the risk. And in the US, you would have this 409A valuation, and you can show it to the tax authorities, and they'll take it at face value, no one ever knows it's worthless. In Japan, you don't have that. So that's the tax risk.
Yeah.
And so for a couple of reasons, it's just really hard to issue tax qualified stock options, especially if you're a young startup. And there are a couple of one or two other very onerous requirements for tax qualified stock options that make it very hard for startups early stage. And what
Yeah,
are those?
if you issue tax qualified stock option, then you and your employees exercise the stock options. The stock acquired by the exercise of stock option have to be kept in custody by securities firm. But it's
For
very
tax qualified stock options.
right. But it's very difficult to find such securities brokerage firm before an IPO.
Yeah.
So the tax qualified stock options were designed for listed companies. So if they are already listed, it's very easy to find securities firm. But if the company issues the stock option in the startup companies, it is very difficult, practically difficult to find such securities firm. So this is the biggest bottleneck.
And so what these companies do is they don't want to have to open an account with a securities firm until they're going to do an IPO. So they add a condition to the stock option, which is you cannot exercise it until we do an IPO. And so that means if it's an M&A exit, tough luck. So companies that are not wedded to doing an IPO, they don't choose the tax qualified stock option for this reason as well. So
And M&A is higher in Japan than it is.
well, so this is another area where Japan is kind of an oddity. In Japan, entrepreneurs, they all want to do IPOs.
Yep.
In the US, they all want to do M&As.
Yep.
So I guess if you know you're going to do an IPO, then it makes sense to have a tax qualified stock option plan.
Yeah.
But if you want to keep your options open, it just doesn't work.
Yeah.
Yeah. So most companies, they choose non-tax qualified stock options because there you have a lot more flexibility. But
In Japan.
In Japan.
In
You have
Japan.
more flexibility, especially with respect to the strike price. You can have strike price of 1 yen.
Whatever you want, yeah.
But you don't get the tax benefit. So it's less tax beneficial to employees, but it's just much easier to implement for companies. A lot of companies end up implementing a non-tax qualified stock option plan.
Okay. I think, so a year later, other people say, oh, it's worth 500 million yen. Say, whoa, wait, we said the maximum amount it could be worth when I put the money in, because you used my money to grow the company, is 100 million yen. So that's how the cap works, right? Even though it's like, oh, it's actually worth a lot more.
Yeah.
So
in
we
essence,
recognize that at that point, that was very valuable money to receive.
discount. The greater the increase in the valuation of the money of the company, the greater the discount is when you convert. And the valuation cap is supposed to be kind of where the investor and the company think the company's valuation will be when there's a conversion event, which can be 6 months, 12 months, 18 months later. It's
Right.
not supposed to be the fair market value of the company at the time of the investment. And that's exactly what you're finding in the Japanese market. More and more investors, when they use J-KISSes, they insist on a valuation cap that's equal to what they consider to be the fair market value of the company at the time they invest. This is a complete perversion of the valuation cap, and I find it shocking.
Don't they often get discounts as well? It's like,
Yeah.
you get a discount to the,
Yeah, so it's the
new fundraise
it's
valuation.
you convert at the price, which is either the discounted price or the valuation cap, whichever is more
Oh,
favorable to
whichever's
the
more
investor.
favorable, okay.
So why not do a Delaware corporation?
If you want to raise money in the U.S., you should do a Delaware corporation.
It's all about raising money in Japan, though.
So if you're going to raise money in Japan, don't do a Delaware corporation.
Yeah, okay.
You can't list a Delaware corporation.
Is there advantage over
And
Japanese
you
money
can't
than
list it
American money?
on, what, take it,
Just
a
the-
public, you mean?
You can't take public in Japan.
Right.
And a lot of Japanese folks won't be interested.
Right.
And there's no angel Zeisei tax credit.
Is it possible to play with two companies and like having the
So-
same product and see which one gets
Yeah.
the money first and then
So-
the one acquires?
So that's
Two of the same company,
So-
covered
so
with two
something-
names?
No, same
Two
name,
like
but
the same.
different entities.
So you have a lot of companies that have their operations in Japan, so they keep a KK.
Yeah.
And then the parent company is in Delaware, and that's where they're raising money. But investors only want to invest, as a general rule, they only want to invest in the parent company, because it's very hard to realize an exit if you're in a subsidiary. So, if you do that structure, sometimes, well, the investment will all be at the Delaware level. Sometimes you have funds, especially governmental funds, that can only invest in KKs, that can only invest in Japanese entities.
So a couple of things. One, I'd like to get a round of applause for our speakers. We have the world famous ACCJ coffee mug
Oh, thank you.
Seen
and
on videos.
certificate of appreciation. Eric, if you'd hold yours.
Thank you.
And your mug.